Today, we are covering and investigating some of the most disturbing cases involving former Navy SEALs, men once regarded as the embodiment of courage, precision, and loyalty. These were individuals trained to operate in the shadows, to uphold honor where others faltered. Yet within that same darkness, some lost their way entirely. Each story in this investigation exposes a painful truth, that even among the most elite, corruption, obsession, and violence can take root. These are men who once carried the nation's trust and shattered it. The case number one in this series of America's most evil Navy SEALs is that of Gregory Kyle Searden. He was once the image of American discipline, a Navy SEAL forged through years of elite training, praised for his precision, strength, and calm under pressure. Gregory Kyle Searden had lived a life built on control, duty, and loyalty to his brothers in arms. But beneath the polished surface of valor and sacrifice, there was another side of him, one that no uniform could redeem. Behind closed doors, Searden harbored a secret so dark it would destroy everything he had ever stood for. For years, his public image masked a private obsession. He had fought for his country abroad, yet at home, he was committing acts that betrayed its most fundamental values. Investigators would later say that Searden lived in two worlds, one of service and one of sin, and that when those worlds collided, the truth exposed a monster disguised as a hero. His downfall began quietly, with a digital footprint left behind, a single clue that led authorities down a path of unimaginable horror. When federal agents uncovered the evidence, it was undeniable. Searden, the same man trusted with national security, had been producing and possessing child exploitation material. His home, once a place of order and respect, became a crime scene filled with proof of corruption and cruelty. The meticulous nature of his files, the organization, the secrecy, it all mirrored the same tactical precision he once used in combat. Only this time, his mission wasn't to protect life, but to destroy innocence. In court, prosecutors described him as a man who weaponized his discipline for evil. He had turned the tools of his training into instruments of deception. The uniform that once symbolized courage now stood as a reminder of how deeply trust can be violated. The jury didn't take long to deliver its verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 87 years in federal prison. For the Navy community, the disgrace was profound. How could one of their own, a man forged in brotherhood and valor, fall so far from grace? Searden's name became a warning, a grim reminder that even within the ranks of the most elite, darkness can take root. His legacy, once tied to courage and service, now lives on as a symbol of betrayal and corruption. Gregory Kyle Searden's story ends not with redemption, but with a lifetime behind bars. He will never again walk free, never again wear the trident that once defined him. His case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil can exist even in those we trust most. And if Searden's crimes represent the darkest extremes of guilt, the next story turns that idea on its head. A man condemned not for his sins, but for someone else's confession too late to undo the damage. Case number two is that of Dustin Turner, a former Navy SEAL whose story became one of the most controversial wrongful convictions in military history. Unlike the predators and criminals who disgrace their uniforms, Turner's tragedy lies in the cost of misplaced justice, a cautionary tale of how the system built to punish the guilty can sometimes destroy the innocent. In 1995, Jennifer Evans, a 21-year-old college student, disappeared after a night out in Virginia Beach. The last people seen with her were two men, Dustin Turner and Billy Joe Brown, both Navy SEAL trainees. Within days, Evans was found dead, her body concealed in a wooded area. Public outrage was instant, and investigators, desperate for answers, turned their focus toward the two young men. What followed was a case driven more by pressure and perception than by proof. Turner, the disciplined and composed SEAL trainee, maintained his innocence. He claimed he had left Evans alive with Brown after a brief encounter. But in the media's eyes, and soon the courtrooms, Turner's Navy background became evidence of danger, not discipline. Brown quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, shifting the narrative and pinning the murder entirely on Turner. His testimony, riddled with inconsistencies, was enough to convince a jury that Turner was the killer. He was sentenced to a life in prison, labeled a murderer, and forgotten by the system he once vowed to serve. Years passed. Then came a twist that changed everything. Billy Joe Brown, the same man whose testimony condemned Turner, confessed that he alone had killed Jennifer Evans, that Turner had no part in the crime whatsoever. The revelation, backed by new evidence, exposed a staggering miscarriage of justice. Turner's conviction was overturned after more than a decade behind bars, but freedom came at a cost. His youth was gone, his reputation destroyed, the Navy career he dreamed of erased forever. Yet despite it all, Turner emerged not with bitterness, but with a voice for reform, a living example of how truth can be buried under the weight of fear and assumption. The case of Dustin Turner reminds us that justice, like honor, is fragile. It demands vigilance, not vengeance. His name stands in contrast to the corruption of the last case, where guilt was undeniable. Here, innocence was sacrificed in the name of closure. And as we move forward, the next case drags us back into the depths of brutality, where loyalty, power, and murder collide in a story so gruesome it shocked even seasoned investigators. Case number 3 is that of Benjamin Seyfried, a former Navy SEAL whose descent into chaos and violence led to one of the most gruesome and senseless murders in modern American history. Unlike the wrongful conviction of Dustin Turner, there was no misunderstanding here, no ambiguity. What unfolded was sheer brutality, a night of paranoia, rage, and unimaginable horror that left 2 innocent tourists dead and dismembered. In May of 2002, Martha Crutchley and Joshua Ford, a couple visiting Ocean City, Maryland, met Benjamin Seyfried and his wife Erica while out for drinks. The 2 couples hit it off and returned to the Seyfried's penthouse condo for what was supposed to be a casual evening. But what began as laughter and light conversation turned into terror. At some point during the night, something triggered Benjamin's darker instincts. A gun was drawn, accusations were shouted, and within minutes the atmosphere shifted from friendly to fatal. Authorities believe paranoia and substance use played a role, but what they uncovered later was far more disturbing. Martha and Joshua were brutally murdered, their bodies dismembered, and their remains scattered, the work of someone with military precision and complete emotional detachment. Investigators were stunned by the cold efficiency of the crime. It wasn't impulsive, it was methodical. Benjamin's SEAL training, once meant to save lives, had been perverted into a tool for destruction. When police raided the Seyfried's condo days later, they found blood, bullet holes, and personal belongings of the victims hidden throughout the apartment. The evidence left little room for doubt. During questioning, Benjamin's demeanor was chilling, detached, unemotional, and eerily calm. He showed none of the remorse expected of an ordinary man, let alone a soldier who once swore to protect others. His trial revealed a toxic mix of control, jealousy, and a deep psychological fracture that turned him into something unrecognizable. Benjamin Seyfried was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 38 years in prison. Erica, who played her own role in the horror, received life behind bars. The story of the Seyfrieds became a symbol of how easily the line between order and chaos can shatter when discipline gives way to depravity. The brutality of this case stands in sharp contrast to the innocence lost in the one before it. Dustin Turner was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Benjamin Seyfried, on the other hand, committed a crime so savage it redefined betrayal itself. But as horrifying as this story is, the next one exposes a different form of danger. A soldier who turned from the battlefield to the black market, trading weapons of war for profit and power. Case number 4 takes us away from murder and into a different realm of corruption, one rooted in greed, deception, and the abuse of military privilege. This is the story of Nicholas Bickle, a U.S. Army soldier whose betrayal wasn't written in blood, but in black market deals that risked the lives of countless others. His crime didn't unfold in the heat of battle, but in the shadows of supply lines, where loyalty was traded for cash and honor became a commodity. Nicholas Bickle wasn't a killer in the conventional sense, but the weapons he smuggled had that very purpose. During his deployment to Iraq, Bickle used his position to exploit the chaos of war for personal gain. While other soldiers fought for stability and safety, He was orchestrating a scheme to steal and traffic military-grade weapons and explosives, including over 30 AK-47 rifles and multiple blocks of C4. These were not minor infractions. They were tools of war, sold into the hands of whoever could pay the price. Investigators eventually traced the illegal shipments back to him. What they found revealed a chilling pattern. A man who had turned his training and access into a business built on betrayal. The precision of his movements, the concealment methods, the timing, all reflected the mindset of someone who knew exactly how to exploit the system. He wasn't reckless, he was deliberate. His actions represented the kind of corruption that endangers not just missions, but the integrity of the entire military structure. When federal agents closed in, Bickle's web of deception collapsed. The charges against him, illegal arms trafficking, possession of explosives, and conspiracy, painted a portrait of a soldier who had abandoned every oath he swore. His courtroom defense argued that greed had clouded his judgment, but the evidence left no room for redemption. The court handed down a long federal sentence, ensuring that his ambition for profit would end where his freedom did. Nicholas Bickle's story is not one of violence committed by hand, but of violence enabled through greed. His betrayal showed that the threat to national security isn't always found on foreign soil. Sometimes it comes from within, and as we move from corruption to confrontation, the next story takes us from the shadows of smuggling to a moment of pure volatility, a heated argument by the Santa Monica Pier that turned into a fatal act of rage. Case number 5 is that of Theo Craw, a man whose story reminds us how quickly anger, pride, and ego can turn a moment of confrontation into irreversible tragedy. Unlike the premeditated brutality of Benjamin Sifrit or the cold greed of Nicholas Bickle, Craw's crime was born out of impulse, a flash of violence that would end a life, destroy another, and echo as a grim lesson in how fragile human restraint truly is. Theo Craw wasn't a household name. He wasn't a career criminal or a notorious offender. He was an ordinary man in many respects, one whose life unraveled in a single night along the sunlit boardwalk of Santa Monica Pier, a place known for laughter, music, and the sound of waves meeting the shore. But on that night, the pier became the setting for something far darker. What began as a heated verbal argument between Craw and another man, Chris Anderson, escalated so quickly that by the time it ended, one of them would never walk away. Witnesses described it as a confrontation that came out of nowhere. Words turned sharp, then physical. A push, a swing. A struggle that spilled toward the edge of the pier. Some said Craw tried to back away. Others said he lunged forward. What no one disputes is the moment when tempers overpowered reason. When Craw's rage, amplified by adrenaline and humiliation, found its release. In that brief explosion of anger, he struck Anderson with lethal force, sending him crashing to the ground. Anderson's injuries were catastrophic. Within minutes, he was gone. The shock rippled through the onlookers, tourists, families, and locals, who had expected nothing more than a calm California evening. Police arrived to a scene of disbelief, where one man stood shaking, repeating that it wasn't supposed to happen. Theo Craw was arrested on the spot. The evidence, the witnesses, and his own trembling confession left no room for ambiguity. But the question that haunted investigators, and later the court, was not what happened, but why. In the courtroom, prosecutors painted Craw as a man with a temper, someone who let pride dictate his actions. They described how a simple argument turned into a fatal mistake because Craw couldn't walk away. The defense, however, argued something different. They spoke of provocation, of how words can cut as deep as knives, and how emotional volatility can make even a rational person lose control. They reminded the court that Craw had no criminal record, no history of violence, that this wasn't the work of a killer, but the tragic act of a man who let emotion eclipse judgment. The jury faced a difficult decision, balancing empathy with accountability. In the end, they found Theo Craw guilty of second-degree murder, a conviction that acknowledged both his responsibility and his humanity. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, one that would give him decades to reflect on a single moment that changed everything. Behind bars, Craw reportedly struggled to come to terms with what he had done. Those close to the case said he was consumed with guilt, haunted by the image of Chris Anderson's final moments. It wasn't a story of evil intent, but of how quickly ordinary conflict can spiral beyond control. His cell became his reminder that 1 second of rage can erase a lifetime of restraint. Theo Craw's case doesn't involve conspiracy or greed or hidden corruption. It's simpler and perhaps more tragic because of it. It speaks to the volatile human instinct that lies dormant in us all, the part that surfaces when pride is wounded, when anger blinds reason. His name doesn't echo in headlines like others, but his story carries a lesson every bit as powerful. That violence often begins not with intent, but with emotion ungoverned. The case of Theo Cry stands as a quiet, somber warning. There were no grand motives, no elaborate schemes, just a single argument that spiraled into irreversible loss. A moment that could have ended with silence instead ended with sirens. And as we leave this tragic act of impulse behind, the next case takes us into the heart of military brotherhood, where loyalty, rivalry, and hazing collided in a tragedy that would expose the dark side of elite military culture itself. Case number 6 is that of Tony Dolph, a name that became synonymous with one of the darkest scandals to ever emerge from the ranks of the U.S. military elite. Dolph was a member of SEAL Team 6, a unit so secretive and revered that even within the armed forces its operations were often spoken of in hushed tones. But behind the heroism and brotherhood that defined the SEALs, Dolph's case revealed a culture of hazing and cruelty that led to a fellow soldier's death, the death of Green Beret Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar. The year was 2017, the location, Bamako, Mali. Officially, the mission was routine, a cooperative deployment of elite forces working under the same flag. Unofficially, tensions were brewing. SEALs Tony Dolph and Adam Matthews, alongside Marine Raiders Kevin Maxwell and others, had clashed repeatedly with Melgar. Reports later revealed resentment, jokes taken too far, and an atmosphere of toxic rivalry fueled by alcohol, ego, and blurred boundaries. What started as fraternity-like banter slowly transformed into hostility. On the night of June 4, 2017, that hostility reached its breaking point. According to investigators, Dolph and his fellow SEALs planned what they called a corrective hazing, a prank meant to humiliate Melgar for allegedly distancing himself from their off-duty behavior. They broke into his room as he slept. What followed was chaos. Dolph and his teammates tackled Melgar, restraining him in a chokehold. Within moments, the tone shifted from laughter to panic. Melgar stopped breathing. The prank had turned fatal. What came next was not a call for help, but a cover-up. The SEALs and Raiders scrambled to fabricate a story, claiming Melgar had died from a training accident. But as investigators dug deeper, their lies began to unravel. Forensic evidence and conflicting testimonies painted a picture of recklessness and arrogance, a lethal mix of power unchecked by accountability. Dolph's role was clear. He had been part of the assault, part of the decision to turn hazing into punishment. The courtroom proceedings that followed exposed more than just the crime itself. They revealed cracks in the very culture that had long been glorified, one where silence, loyalty, and pride often outweighed truth. Witnesses described an environment where hazing was normalized, where toughening each other up blurred the line between discipline and cruelty. Prosecutors called it what it was: manslaughter born from ego. Tony Dolph's conviction marked a turning point. Found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, he faced years behind bars, a fraction of Melgar's stolen lifetime, but enough to ensure his name would forever carry the weight of disgrace. For the military community, it was a wake-up call. For Melgar's family, it was a hollow form of justice. The tragedy of this case lies not only in the death itself, but in the circumstances surrounding it. These were men trained to fight side by side, to protect one another under fire. Instead, one of them was killed by his own brothers in arms in an act that betrayed everything they were meant to stand for. Tony Dolph's story is a reminder that the greatest threats to integrity often come from within. His fall from grace wasn't just personal. It was symbolic of a deeper issue within elite units that thrive on secrecy and pride. It showed that even the most elite soldiers are not immune to moral decay when accountability fades and ego takes control. As Dolph began serving his sentence, questions lingered, not just about what happened that night, but about the culture that allowed it to happen at all. And while Dolph's conviction brought some measure of closure, the story didn't end there. The next case brings us even closer to the heart of that same tragedy, revealing how others involved in Logan Melgar's death would face their own reckoning, and how justice struggled to keep pace with loyalty's darkest side. Case number 7 is that of Kevin Maxwell, another figure entangled in the same tragedy that claimed the life of Green Beret Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar in Mali. Like Tony Dolph before him, Maxwell was part of the elite, a Marine Raider trained for precision and discipline. His mission was to serve beside America's most skilled warriors. Instead, his name became forever linked to betrayal, negligence, and the shattering of military brotherhood. The events of June 4, 2017 remain among the most disturbing in modern military history. That night, deep inside a compound in Bamako, a prank turned into a fatal act. It began with whispered resentment. Melgar, a disciplined soldier, had reportedly distanced himself from the reckless behavior of some members of SEAL Team 6 and the Marine Raiders stationed with them. He didn't drink, didn't partake in their off-duty escapades, and his professionalism, instead of earning respect, drew mockery. To the others, it became a challenge, a wound to their pride. Kevin Maxwell, alongside SEALs Tony Dolph and Adam Matthews, decided to teach Melgar a lesson. They planned what they described as a hazing, an act of humiliation designed to break the Green Berets' stoic composure. But what unfolded in that small, dimly lit room was far from a prank. In the early hours before dawn, the men entered Melgar's quarters. Within minutes, a chokehold meant for humiliation turned into suffocation. Melgar stopped breathing. In those moments, panic replaced laughter, and the silence of death filled the air. Rather than call for help immediately, Maxwell and the others hesitated, scrambling to invent an explanation. They tried to mask their actions, concocting a story about a training accident. But the truth has a way of surfacing. Autopsy reports contradicted their claims, and inconsistencies in their accounts led investigators straight to the men responsible. When confronted, Maxwell eventually admitted to his role, acknowledging that he had participated, that he had stood by as the situation spiraled out of control. His trial exposed more than one man's guilt. It peeled back the layers of a culture that had long hidden behind secrecy and brotherhood. Inside those elite circles, loyalty was everything. But in this case, loyalty had turned toxic. The military court heard testimony about the normalization of hazing, about pranks that crossed ethical lines, and about silence being treated as a code of honor. It wasn't just about one fatal night, it was about the unchecked arrogance that allowed it to happen. Kevin Maxwell pleaded guilty to charges of involuntary manslaughter and hazing. His sentence, several years in prison and a dishonorable discharge, reflected not only his actions, but his failure to stop what he knew was wrong. For the Melgar family, the punishment was bittersweet. No conviction could bring back their son, husband, or friend. For the military, it was another stain. A sign that even within the most elite ranks, discipline could be corroded by recklessness. Maxwell's case serves as a sobering reflection of how fragile honor can become when pride outweighs accountability. He was not a monster in the traditional sense, but a man who made a devastating series of choices, each one pulling him further from the principles he once swore to uphold. His name now sits beside Dolph's in the annals of military disgrace, both men bound forever by a single act of senseless violence that should never have happened. The story of Kevin Maxwell is one of loss, not only of life, but of integrity, trust, and the moral compass that once defined the warrior ethos. And as we continue, the next case shows how the ripples of this same tragedy spread even further, to another SEAL who would face his own reckoning for the same fatal night that forever changed the brotherhood of America's most elite warriors. Case number 8 is that of Adam Matthews, another Navy SEAL whose name became inseparable from the tragic death of Green Beret Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar. Matthews, like Tony Dolph and Kevin Maxwell, had worn the trident with pride. He had undergone the grueling physical and psychological trials that only the most disciplined can endure. But behind the veil of loyalty and camaraderie, He too became part of the fateful chain of events that exposed one of the most shameful chapters in the history of America's Special Operations Forces. In June 2017, the elite were stationed together in Bamako, Mali, tasked with a covert mission requiring cooperation and trust. Yet beneath the surface of that shared duty, tension was festering. Melgar's professionalism, his refusal to indulge in the reckless, off-duty behavior of some of his fellow soldiers, had made him a target of resentment. The very traits that should have earned him respect instead provoked ridicule. To some, including Matthews, it became a challenge to their authority. A perceived act of superiority that bruised fragile egos in a unit built on strength. On the night of June 4th, that hostility boiled over. Matthews joined Tony Dolph, Kevin Maxwell, and others in what they described as a prank. They broke into Melgar's quarters while he slept, planning to restrain and humiliate him. Witnesses later described it as part of an ongoing culture of hazing, one normalized within some corners of the elite forces where testing one another's limits had blurred into cruelty. But the prank spiraled into catastrophe. As Melgar struggled, he was placed in a chokehold. Within seconds, the situation went from laughter to panic. When the men realized he had stopped breathing, it was too late. The aftermath was chaos. Matthews and his fellow SEALs attempted to save face, concocting a story that framed the death as a training mishap. But when inconsistencies surfaced and the autopsy confirmed asphyxiation, the truth began to close in. Investigators uncovered messages, witness statements, and timelines that exposed a cover-up. Matthews' role became undeniable. He had participated, failed to intervene, and then conspired to conceal the truth. When brought before a military court, Matthews did something rare. He admitted his guilt. He pleaded guilty to hazing, assault, and conspiracy charges. The courtroom heard his voice tremble as he took responsibility for the part he played in Melgar's death. He described the night as a moment of reckless arrogance, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His plea spared him a longer prison sentence, but it did not spare him disgrace. He was dishonorably discharged, stripped of his rank, and expelled from the brotherhood he had once considered sacred. What makes Adam Matthews' case particularly haunting is the humanity behind the crime. He was not inherently cruel, not sadistic by nature, but complacent. He was part of a culture that blurred discipline with dominance, that excused abuse as bonding, and that taught silence as a form of loyalty. In that silence, morality vanished. Matthews' fall is a mirror held up to the dangers of unchecked power. How even the most decorated soldiers can lose sight of the values they swore to defend when pride and conformity replace conscience. Today, Adam Matthews' name stands as a permanent reminder that the deadliest betrayals aren't always those of violence, but of trust. His actions, like those of his co-defendants, stripped away the illusion of invulnerability that had long surrounded the SEALs and Marine Raiders. The death of Logan Melgar became more than a single tragedy. It became a reckoning. It forced the world to see that beneath the medals and mystique, even the best can falter when ego overshadows ethics. And as we move to the next case, the story shifts from internal betrayal to the battlefield itself. A tale of a SEAL whose reputation, trial, and acquittal would divide the nation and redefine what it means to face judgment under the shadow of war. Case number 9 is that of Eddie Gallagher, a Navy SEAL whose name became one of the most polarizing and controversial in recent American military history. A decorated combat veteran, Gallagher served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and was widely known among his peers as an aggressive, fearless operator. To some, he was the embodiment of the warrior ethos, relentless, unbreakable, and willing to do whatever it took to complete the mission. But to others, his story represented something far darker, the line where duty ends and moral corruption begins. The events that would turn Gallagher into a household name unfolded in 2017 during his deployment to Mosul, Iraq. His platoon, part of SEAL Team 7, was tasked with rooting out ISIS fighters from one of the most violent and chaotic war zones on Earth. By then, Gallagher was already a seasoned veteran, revered by subordinates for his combat experience, but feared for his volatility. Reports from within his own unit would later describe a man who had crossed a line, one who treated the battlefield not as a place of duty, but as a stage for domination. According to testimonies later revealed in court, Gallagher allegedly stabbed a wounded teenage ISIS fighter who had been captured and was receiving medical treatment. Several members of his unit claimed they witnessed the act, a killing that, if true, would constitute a war crime. The accusations didn't stop there. Gallagher was also accused of firing indiscriminately into civilian areas and of posing for a photo with the corpse of the teenage prisoner, an image that would later define his entire case. When the allegations surfaced, they tore through the ranks of the Navy like a shockwave. Gallagher was arrested and held in pretrial confinement, facing charges of murder, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. His case became a lightning rod for national debate, one that split the public between those who saw him as a hero unfairly persecuted by bureaucracy and those who saw a soldier who had lost sight of morality in the fog of war. During his court-martial, the prosecution presented harrowing testimony from Gallagher's own platoon members, men who described feeling betrayed by a leader they once admired. But the case soon unraveled. The key witness, a medic from Gallagher's unit, took the stand and shocked the courtroom by claiming that he, not Gallagher, had caused the ISIS fighter's death by asphyxiation after Gallagher had already stabbed him. That single moment dismantled the prosecution's case and turned the trial on its head. In July 2019, Eddie Gallagher was acquitted of the most serious charges, including murder and attempted murder. He was, however, found guilty of one offense, posing for a photo with the corpse of the teenage fighter, a violation of military law and ethics that underscored the moral decay surrounding the incident. The verdict sparked outrage among some and relief among others. Gallagher was demoted in rank, but soon after, a presidential intervention restored his title and allowed him to retire honorably. The controversy didn't end there. Gallagher's case exposed deep fractures within the SEAL community, between those who saw him as a symbol of the warrior's burden and those who viewed him as proof of how unchecked aggression can corrode honor. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions. How far should a soldier go in war? Where does valor end and savagery begin? Eddie Gallagher's story remains a haunting reflection of the moral gray zones of modern warfare. His acquittal did not erase the unease his actions inspired. It stands as a warning of how easily righteousness can be warped by power and how the myth of the perfect soldier can crumble under the weight of human imperfection. And as we turn from the battlefield back to the courtroom, the next case draws our focus to another kind of injustice. One not of war, but of law, where the system designed to uphold fairness instead became the source of corruption itself. Case number 10 is that of Keith Barry, a U.S. Navy sailor whose case exposed not just the flaws of a single man, but the systemic cracks within the very institution meant to deliver justice. His story isn't one of war crimes or battlefield misconduct. Instead, it is a legal tragedy that forced the military to confront its own failures. How command influence, corruption, and institutional pressure can derail truth, destroy reputations, and taint the concept of justice itself. Keith Barry was convicted of rape while serving in the Navy, a conviction that would brand him a criminal, cost him his career, and leave a permanent stain on his life. For years, the case stood as another example of the military's zero-tolerance approach to sexual assault, a measure meant to protect victims and enforce accountability. But beneath the surface of that righteous goal, Barry's trial was far from fair. It would later be revealed that his conviction wasn't the result of clear evidence or impartial judgment, but of unlawful command influence, a term that carries devastating weight in military law. Unlawful command influence, often called the mortal enemy of military justice, refers to the improper use of authority to sway the outcome of a trial. In Barry's case, senior officers had pressured subordinates to secure a conviction, turning what should have been an objective legal process into a political performance. Evidence was questioned, testimonies were manipulated, and decisions were made not in the pursuit of truth, but to protect reputations and uphold the Navy's public image. For Barry, the result was catastrophic. He was sentenced to prison, discharged in disgrace, and cast out from the only life he had known. The label of rapist followed him everywhere, a mark that destroyed his career his relationships, and his future. But through it all, he maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been sacrificed to preserve the appearance of military integrity rather than the reality of it. Years later, after persistent appeals and the intervention of higher courts, the truth began to surface. Investigators uncovered clear evidence that senior officials had indeed interfered in the judicial process, that Barry's right to a fair trial had been compromised from the beginning. The ruling that followed was monumental. Keith Barry's conviction was overturned. Judges declared that unlawful command influence had poisoned the proceedings beyond repair, rendering the entire case invalid. For Barry, vindication came too late. His name had already been destroyed, his career permanently lost. The court's decision couldn't return the years stolen from him, nor erase the stigma that still followed him in civilian life. But his case became a defining moment for the military justice system, forcing leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth: that even within an institution built on honor, power can corrupt the pursuit of justice itself. The Navy's legal community faced heavy criticism. Experts and advocates called for deeper reform, demanding that no commander, regardless of rank, ever again hold the power to influence verdicts. Barry's ordeal became a symbol of how the very systems designed to protect can, when twisted by politics and pride, become instruments of destruction. Keith Barry's story is not one of innocence or guilt in the traditional sense. It is a story about fairness, or rather, the lack of it. It asks a question that lingers long after the verdicts fade. What happens when justice itself becomes the casualty? With his overturned conviction, Barry joined a small but significant list of service members whose names forced change in a system long resistant to accountability. His case closes this chapter of fallen warriors and fractured honor, a collection of stories that remind us that corruption doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it hides behind medals, behind authority, and behind the promise of justice itself. And as this series of cases draws to an end, one truth echoes louder than the rest. Valor may be earned on the battlefield, but integrity is tested everywhere else.